At 11:30 on a freezing Tuesday night, Officer Marcus Vance's dashcam was rolling. The checkpoint log showed 0 infractions, and the word threat existed nowhere in the digital shift report. Judge Evelyn Hayes knew none of that. She was thinking about the exhausting 4-hour docket she had just wrapped up, the heavy leather briefcase on the passenger seat containing confidential appellate reviews, and whether the aging sedan's heater would survive another winter storm sweeping across district borders. Freezing rain lashed against the windshield as blinding high beams filled the rearview mirror. A heavy flashlight cracked against the driver's side window twice, hard, before she had even shifted the gear into park. She kept both hands steady where they could be clearly seen, resting high on the steering wheel. Fingers spread wide in quiet compliance. The sleet came down sideways, turning the isolated rural checkpoint into a slick sheet of black ice. And the halogen beam pointed straight into her eyes was bright enough to erase the silhouette of the man holding it. She did not raise a hand to block the glare. Decades in the legal system had taught her that the safest response to a nervous officer on a volatile night was absolute stillness. "License and registration," the trooper barked, offering no greeting or reason for the stop. "May I ask what reason we're stopping at this checkpoint tonight?" Evelyn's voice remained even and measured, the exact tone she used to command unruly courtrooms. She was 52, 10 years on the federal bench, driving a modest sedan while wearing a plain, dark wool coat. Tonight, she was nobody's honor. She was simply bone-tired. "I didn't ask you questions. I asked for your license and registration." Officer Dale Brooks leaned closer, the smell of stale tobacco hitting the damp air. His right hand rested on the grip of his service weapon, ensuring she noticed the implied threat. "My identification is inside the leather briefcase on the passenger seat," Evelyn stated. "I am going to reach for it now using my right hand. Is that acceptable?" "Just get the documents." She moved with deliberate slowness, narrating every single inch of her movement. Behind Brooks, a younger officer named Liam Vance watched nervously, his hand near the dashcam, sensing that this routine stop was heading down a dangerous and unlawful path. "I said keep your hands where I can see them," Brooks snapped, his voice suddenly jumping half an octave. It wasn't genuine fear of her. It was something uglier, the sudden irritation of realizing she wasn't cowering, and that her absolute composure completely stripped away his petty sense of authority. "I'm opening the briefcase for the identification you requested," Evelyn replied, her voice firm, steady, and entirely devoid of panic. "My hands are moving slowly and remain completely visible." Stepping back with a jerky motion, Brooks slammed his hand against the patrol car's fender before unholstering his sidearm, the black muzzle rising uncomfortably toward her face through the drizzle on the glass. "Show me your hands! Step out of the vehicle right now!" Evelyn froze. She raised both palms toward him, completely empty, holding them away from the briefcase with deliberate grace. She had stared down aggressive litigants and hostile federal defendants over a decade on the bench. Now, she was looking down the trembling barrel of a small-town trooper who had terrified himself into believing a threat existed entirely within his own distorted imagination. "My hands are completely visible," she stated, every single word ringing flat, calm, and unmistakably clear. "I am an officer of the court. I am unarmed and I am not a threat. Lower your weapon immediately. You are escalating a routine checkpoint stop into a catastrophic mistake." It was her absolute calm that unraveled him completely. Not defiance, but quiet, immovable authority. The distinct tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed instantly, aimed directly at a man who desperately needed her to beg so he could justify his aggression, and who utterly loathed the fact that she refused to break. "Dale, stop! What are you doing?" Liam Vance started, his young voice cracking sharply in the damp night air, his fingers trembling against the edge of the dashcam unit. The brutal crack of the service pistol swallowed the remainder of his warning. The driver's side window exploded outward in a blinding shower of safety glass, while white-hot pain tore through Evelyn's left shoulder, knocking her hard against the center console. The howling rain instantly faded into a high-pitched, deafening ring, and sudden, dark warmth began spreading rapidly across the dark wool of her coat over her collarbone. Brooks was already screaming frantically into his shoulder radio, fabricating the narrative before her blood even had time to stain the rubber floor mat. He had no earthly idea who she was, nor did he care. Shots fired. Driver lunged for a concealed weapon. I had to take the shot. He paced furiously in the freezing mud, his voice climbing higher as he aggressively rehearsed a script he had clearly deployed before. "You saw it happen, Liam. She reached under the seat for something deadly." Liam stood frozen for a second, his boots stuck in the slush, staring through the shattered window at the dark figure slumped against the console. He didn't answer Marcus's frantic prompt. Instead, he dropped to his knees by the open door, his hands shaking as he pulled the trauma kit from his tactical belt. He didn't switch his dashcam off. The digital red light remained steadily blinking, capturing every frantic movement, every muttered instruction, and every desperate breath. "Ma'am, stay with me. Keep your eyes on me," Liam stammered, pressing a thick pad of sterile gauze directly against the wound above her collarbone where Evelyn guided his trembling fingers with surprising firmness. "Press harder right here," Liam asked, his voice cracking. "Higher," she rasped, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that entirely bypassed the pain. "And listen to me very carefully. The leather briefcase on the seat, the brass locks are engaged. Whatever happens next, those federal seals must remain intact. Keep that camera rolling." "You don't talk to her, rookie. She's a hostile suspect." Brooks lunged forward through the sleet, grabbing Liam by the tactical collar of his vest and hauling him backward into the rain. "Secure her hands right now before she reaches for something else. She's bleeding out on the floor." Liam shoved Brooks away with a sudden flash of raw defiance that stunned them both. Stepping back to press his hands firmly back onto the wound, Brooks didn't push it further. A cold, sudden realization flickered across his face. He remembered the flashing red recording light on the dashboard, and his mind instantly pivoted from the dying woman to the incident report he needed to craft. Sirens wailed in the distance, cutting through the storm as two more county cruisers and an emergency transport slewed into the cordoned checkpoint lot. Paramedics spilled out into the freezing downpour, shouldering past the troopers to slide Evelyn onto a gurney. One medic sliced through the soaked wool of her coat with trauma shears to expose the injury, but his hands froze mid-motion. His fingers brushed against a heavy, dull silver chain resting against her chest. He lifted the medallion with 2 fingers, read the deep-stamped federal lettering, and went completely pale. "Boyd, Evelyn, Chief Judge, U.S. District Court." Captain Roy Vandergriff arrived on the scene just as the second ambulance began reversing out of the cordoned checkpoint. He did not glance at the shattered safety glass littering the pavement, or question why a cooperative motorist was bleeding into an emergency gurney. Instead, he walked straight toward Brooks, listening intently to AAN Brooks's rehearsed version. Combative, reaching aggressively for a concealed object, an immediate threat to officer safety, and nodded along in grim agreement. Because that convenient narrative made a freezing, complicated night beautifully simple. "Toss the vehicle from bumper to bumper," Vandergriff instructed another trooper, gesturing casually toward the battered sedan. "Find me whatever she was reaching for." He knew perfectly well there was no weapon. Experienced commanders knew how these situations worked long before the evidence bags were opened. What he desperately needed was not truth, but a watertight narrative. Within 20 minutes, he had posted a heavily armed guard outside her hospital recovery room and officially logged the chief judge as a criminal suspect under arrest for assaulting a peace officer, placing a prisoner under armed guard before she had even cleared the surgical doors. A self-serving press release began drafting itself inside his head. An alert officer forced to take decisive action. During a tense confrontation with an uncooperative, aggressive driver, clean, contained, and completely untouchable. He had buried half a dozen similar disciplinary crises before. This one would be no different. What Vandergriff could not possibly foresee, however, was a silent red warning light blinking furiously on a secure digital terminal 90 miles away inside the regional Federal District Administrative Hub, Judge Hayes had failed to check into her secure judicial residence following her evening docket review. Standard federal security protocols instantly tracked her encrypted judicial device, and the active GPS coordinates pinged directly from inside the intensive surgical ward of Bishop's Mill Memorial Hospital. Senior clerk Arthur Pendleton stared at the flashing red display in stunned disbelief. He knew Evelyn the way only a close confidant and longtime clerk could. She was methodical, precise, and never missed a mandatory status ping. She did not end up under armed guard in a municipal hospital ward by random accident. Within 10 minutes, Pendleton made 3 highly classified emergency calls, mobilizing a chain of command that answered exclusively to federal oversight, completely bypassing Halford County's corrupt local badge holders. By the time dawn broke cold and gray over Bishop's Mill, the freezing rain had finally eased, and a heavily armored federal convoy that Vandergriff's local authority could neither stop nor turn away was already rolling down the highway, armed with federal warrants. Strict jurisdictional overrides and questions the local precinct had no honest way to answer. The armored federal vehicles slid to a halt outside the precinct doors just as the morning shift change commenced. Federal investigator Thomas Cole and Special Agent Sarah Drake stepped out of the lead vehicle, carrying federal warrants signed directly by the Circuit Oversight Committee. Captain Vandergriff adjusted his uniform jacket, stepping into the hallway with a practiced, confident smirk, ready to dismiss them, as he had done with routine inquiries before. "Gentlemen, you're stepping outside your jurisdiction," Vandergriff began, his voice dripping with small-town authority. This was a legitimate checkpoint stop involving an uncooperative motorist who resisted an officer. Thomas Cole did not raise his voice. He reached into a heavy leather folio and extracted a pristine, tamper-evident federal evidence bag containing the digital storage drive pulled directly from rookie Liam Vance's cruiser Dashcam. "Captain Vandergriff, your officer fired live rounds into a sitting chief federal district judge during an uninfracted checkpoint stop," Cole stated calmly, each word carrying the weight of an unavoidable avalanche. Federal jurisdiction supersedes local oversight the moment a federal magistrate's constitutional rights and physical safety are criminally violated under color of law. Vandergriff's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before hardening into defiance. "Internal Affairs is already reviewing the incident report. We have statements affirming the suspect reached aggressively toward a concealed item." Sarah Drake stepped forward, holding up a certified copy of the recovered judicial credentials and the digital evidence transcript. The only thing she was reaching for was her federal identification, Captain. And unlike your officer's conveniently disabled unit, the rookie's dashcam recorded every single frame from a rear-angle view, capturing audio that is exceptionally clear and completely devastating to the fiction your department manufactured. Inside the precinct command room, the atmosphere shifted instantly from routine bureaucracy to clinical dread. Drake marched past Vandergriff straight toward the digital server racks, accompanied by armed federal marshals with absolute legal authority to seize every dispatch log and internal disciplinary record. Vandergriff reached instinctively for his phone, but a federal marshal's hand firmly blocked his wrist, signaling that the institutional armor protecting their corruption had finally been shattered. Inside the interrogation room, Cole and Drake plugged the retrieved digital drive into a secure forensic laptop. The audio played back crisp and undeniable through the speakers. Judge Hayes's calm, measured voice clearly identifying her position, her deliberate narration of every movement, her hands held open and empty in the air, followed immediately by Brooks's erratic shouting and the thunderous crack of the service weapon. There was no lunging, no concealed weapon, no sudden threat, only an arrogant officer executing an unprovoked shot out of bruised ego and panic. "The audio doesn't lie, Captain," Cole said coldly, turning the laptop screen toward Vandergriff, who had been brought in under federal escort. "Your officer didn't fire in self-defense. He executed an assault under color of law." Vandergriff stared at the glowing screen, his face draining of color as the undeniable reality of the recording stripped away every fabricated line of his incident report. The brotherhood he had protected for years suddenly felt fragile, transactional, and entirely disposable. Drake didn't stop there. Moving to the precinct's archived records terminal, she bypassed local encryption protocols using a federal subpoena override and accessed the internal affairs database. Buried deep within the inactive files lay a pattern of systemic brutality. 5 separate excessive force complaints filed against Dale Brooks over the past 4 years, all quietly dismissed, sealed, or altered under Vandergriff's direct signature to protect precinct metrics. One file caught her eye, a 19-year-old college student named Maya Ortiz, ironically no relation to young Liam, who had been hospitalized with severe fractures after a minor traffic stop gone wrong. "Look at this, Thomas," Drake called out, holding up the digitized PDF of Maya's suppressed medical report and settlement NDA. Vandergriff didn't just cover up one rogue cop, he ran a systemic protection racket. The weight of federal indictments hung heavy in the room. Realizing he was facing decades behind bars for conspiracy and obstruction, Vandergriff's loyalty evaporated instantly. He slumped back into his chair, his voice hollow. "Brooks acted on his own initiative," Vandergriff muttered, immediately turning on his subordinate to save his own skin. "I just signed the paperwork my shift commanders handed me." Special Agent Drake left Vandergriff in the custody of the marshals and walked down the precinct's concrete corridor, toward the back break room where Dale Brooks was still sitting. Brooks had spent the morning nursing a stale cup of coffee and repeating his rehearsed script to anyone unfortunate enough to listen. A combative suspect, a sudden movement toward a concealed weapon, a split-second decision any officer would have made to protect his partner. Drake pushed the heavy fire door open without knocking. She didn't draw a weapon or raise her voice. She simply set a sleek, anti-static evidence pouch containing the digital drive onto the laminate table right in front of him. Inside it lay the undeniable proof, a wide-angle digital recording capturing the freezing rain, the absolute compliance of a tired woman holding her hands high in the air, the unprovoked crack of his service weapon, and the desperate radio call he had immediately fabricated to save his badge. Your dashboard unit automatically saved the footage to the cloud the moment the cruiser's ignition was cut. "Officer Brooks," Drake said quietly, her tone entirely devoid of heat, "and your rookie partner's camera captured everything else from the rear angle, including your conversation immediately following the shot. You didn't fire because you feared for your life. You fired because an unarmed woman refused to cower before your authority." The bravado that had fueled Brooks's entire career drained out of his face in a single, sudden rush. He looked down at his own calloused hands as if they belonged to a total stranger. "She was nobody," he muttered defensively, his voice cracking under the weight of his own words. "Just another driver passing through on a bad night." "She is the chief judge of the federal district court," Cole interjected, stepping silently into the break room behind Drake with a pair of steel handcuffs ready. "And you just committed a felony under color of law." In it. Faced with the crushing weight of federal indictments and digital evidence that could not be scrubbed, Captain Vandergriff's protective network dissolved overnight. In an interrogation room down the hall, Vandergriff desperately attempted to salvage his career by offering a signed statement backdating disciplinary warnings against Brooks, painting himself as an unwitting supervisor misled by a rogue officer's fraudulent report. Special Agent Drake listened to the captain's self-serving rationalizations without a trace of emotion. When Vandergriff finished, she slid a secondary file folder across the metal table, containing the exact digital audit logs showing Vandergriff's personal authorization codes overriding and sealing Maya Ortiz's brutality complaint 3 years prior. "You didn't just supervise a corrupt officer, Captain," Drake said quietly. "You engineered the architecture of impunity that made last night's shooting possible." Across the city at Brennan Federal Medical Center, the heavy oak doors of the recovery suite remained guarded, but the armed municipal detail outside had been replaced by silent, watchful U.S. Marshals. Judge Hayes regained consciousness just after noon, her left shoulder stabilized by a titanium plate, her mind remarkably sharp despite the lingering trauma. Senior Clerk Pendleton stood beside her bed, laying out the encrypted case briefs and the complete transcript of rookie Liam Vance's unedited dashcam footage. Evelyn adjusted her position against the pillows, her eyes fixed on the glowing screen displaying the federal charges filed against Brooks and Vandergriff. Do not let them treat this as an isolated incident involving one panicked patrolman, she instructed, her voice raspy but carrying the unmistakable authority of the bench. Pull every suppressed file from that precinct over the last 5 years. If we only prosecute the triggerman, we leave the rot alive. Federal Prosecutor Marcus Hale, standing near the window, nodded gravely. The machinery of true accountability was already in motion, moving far beyond the borders of Halford County. The federal grand jury proceedings moved with a merciless precision that local politics could neither stall nor derail. In a packed federal courtroom in the district capital, Prosecutor Marcus Hale laid out the evidence piece by piece before Judge Walter Sterling. There were no emotional pleas or closed-door compromises. The digital architecture of the cover-up was dismantled in plain view. First came the unedited dashcam footage from rookie Liam Vance's cruiser, the pristine audio capturing Evelyn Hayes's absolute compliance, her hands raised and empty, followed instantly by the malicious crack of Dale Brooks's service weapon and his frantic, fabricated radio broadcast. Next came the forensic digital audit logs proving that Captain Vandergriff had personally overridden, sealed, and buried 5 separate excessive force complaints against Brooks spanning over 4 years, including the suppressed brutality file of 19-year-old Maya Ortiz. The defense attorneys appointed to represent the fallen officers stood mutely before the bench, utterly devoid of arguments, as the overwhelming weight of federal documentation exposed a systemic criminal enterprise operating behind a badge of authority. Brooks sat at the defense table, his eyes fixed blankly on the polished mahogany wood, the sudden realization finally sinking in that his uniform had never made him untouchable. It had merely delayed a reckoning he could no longer outrun. Vandergriff, realizing his subordinates had traded every buried memo to save themselves, sat rigid, his career reduced to a stack of exhibits marked for permanent forfeiture. Prosecutor Hale did not ask for leniency, nor did he offer any plea deals. He demanded maximum statutory sentences for deprivation of rights under color of law, federal conspiracy, evidence tampering, and intentional obstruction of justice. The federal sentencing hearing concluded not with a spectacle, but with the quiet, crushing weight of absolute justice. Judge Walter Sterling handed down consecutive federal sentences without the possibility of parole, ensuring that badge holders who preyed upon the citizens they swore to protect would finally face the full measure of the law. Dale Brooks stood silently as the gavel fell, his arrogance completely stripped away, while Roy Vandergriff's frantic attempts to shift blame earned him an even harsher penalty for conspiracy and systematic evidence tampering. Across the district, the systemic rot within the Halford County precinct was surgically excised under the supervision of a federal monitor. The buried files of past victims, Tasha Greer, Maya Ortiz, and others whose voices had been intentionally silenced, were formally reopened and reviewed, bringing long overdue exoneration and accountability. Rookie Liam Vance was officially commended for his integrity, protected under federal whistleblower provisions, and given a clear path forward in law enforcement to build a system worthy of public trust. Months later, inside the federal district courtroom, Chief Judge Evelyn Hayes returned to the bench. Her left shoulder remained slightly stiff, a permanent reminder etched in titanium and bone, a physical record of a night corruption tried to bury. She did not speak of vengeance or personal triumph. She spoke of duty, of institutional integrity, and of the sacred trust placed in those who wear the badge. She set a single pristine item on the edge of her desk, the sealed federal folder, its stamp entirely unbroken. The seal had held. Outside, the autumn air was crisp and clear, carrying the promise of a rebuilt justice system where no badge could ever become a license to decide who mattered. She squared her shoulders, adjusted her robes, and presided over the court, knowing that the law had finally proven larger than any single man who thought he was above it.